Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast, broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain, south of Area 51. My name is Ryan, the original overseer of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode tonight. Today's amazing guest is Chuck Zukowski. If you've read the book by Ben Mesrick called The 37th Parallel, well, then I can stop right there. Just kidding. But seriously, Chuck is exactly as motivated as the book makes him out to be. Aside from being a microchip engineer and sheriff deputy, Chuck is recognized as one of the most hardcore boots-on-the-ground researchers out there, and with good reason. I had the pleasure of meeting Chuck in the Uinta Basin, of all places, while he was filming the pilot episode of Alien Highway. And I can attest that the reason Chuck is recognized as one of the most motivated researchers out there is because it's true. Chuck Zukowski has documented hundreds of bizarre incidents, UFO sightings, and cattle mutilations. He is also in charge of the popular website ufonut.com, where you can find all kinds of info and what Chuck is usually up to. Chuck has been featured on many television, radio, and podcasts worldwide. He is a wealth of knowledge and information, and I'm excited to have him on the show. Chuck, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. It was fun shooting in Utah with you. I've talked to other podcasters actually about you, Ryan. About some of the experiences you've had there, and how you were a wealth of knowledge while we were shooting. Actually, we were shooting our second episode.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we were already boots on the ground and going. But I tell you, we had a few. We did 8 episodes of Alien Highway, and one of the episodes I was really looking forward to was Utah. Your neck of the ground, I guess. I should say. So I was really having a lot of fun down there. Obviously, we didn't like the snow, cold weather. But I do live in Colorado, so I'm somewhat used to that. So I wouldn't do that.
Yeah, that was great. And Chuck, let me ask you a question, kind of jumping off point here. You wrote an amazing piece on your website, which we mentioned, ufonut.com, about the alien hydrogen hypothesis. And this is a mind-blowing theory that may explain some of the activity in a place I frequent often, which we just mentioned from a research perspective, the Uinta Basin of Utah. Can you tell our listeners, and other places, can you tell our listeners more about the theory?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always loaded, full of theories. The 37th parallel, started off with something I could say happening across the U.S. But something I've always pondered about, let's say, is alien bases and why certain parts of the U.S. may have more of a density of UFO sightings. Now, UFO sightings occur all over the U.S., but they got to be coming from somewhere. And it's true. There's what I believe in. There's a lot of bases underwater. The Earth is covered 70% of water, but every one of my sightings, where there's been sightings multiple times, there always seems to be a water source nearby. even with cattle mutilation or animal mutilation investigations that I've done, there always seems to be some type of water source, if it be a stream or a lake, or even in some cases large animal water troughs. In cases where I've done UFO investigations and cattle mutilation investigations, balls of light appear. And balls of light aren't really considered orbs. Orbs are more spiritual-like. If you watch a lot of ghost hunting shows, ghost investigating shows on TV, when they talk about a ball of light or an orb, that's different. An orb is spiritual energy. A ball of light is more mechanical. It's more like a probe. And they've been around for a long time. They've been seen all through history and really prevalent during World War II. They were known as the Foo Fighters. We saw them. The Japanese pilots saw them. We thought it was the Japanese. Japanese thought it was us. Either way, even animal mutilations for balls of light are seen. There's some type of a water source. So you're trying to figure out, okay, what's so significant about water that UFOs love? And not just hiding it. In the ocean, obviously they can go pretty far down into the ocean and have a base underwater. But there's others, but when they're seen in lakes where maybe, lakes may only be 100 feet deep or so, or even less than that, or they've seen near streams may only be a couple of feet deep. There's got to be, they're not hiding. There's got to be another reason for it. So if you look at water is H2O, right? So it's 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. Mm-hmm. Now, hydrogen is pretty easy to get. We have hydrogen in our atmosphere and hydrogen in our water. Oxygen, a little harder to get, only because there's really not as much oxygen in the air as you would think. So it'd be easier for UFOs to get hydrogen out of the air because there's actually more hydrogen in our atmosphere than there is oxygen, and there's a lot of hydrogen in our water. So the theory is hydrogen is what they like. Now, either used for propulsion or to sustain life or whatever, but it always seems to be hydrogen was the key. So now you look at places across the globe where there's a lot of sightings, and of course there's a lot of water sightings. Okay, there's hydrogen. But when you look on the continent, you've got to look at other places other than lakes that that are pretty common that would give them hydrogen. So then you start looking at the underwater systems, aquifers. When you start looking at aquifers, one of the things about the 37 parallel theory was that theory is basically an extraterrestrial highway that shoots across the United States on the 37th degree latitude, a little bit in the 38th, a little bit in the 36th. But if you look at the 37th degree latitude, you can hit every one of our aquifers, underground water sources. And there's a lot of caverns. So if there were any type of military bases underground, it looks like they may have a connection to a water source. Maybe they want to be near a water source. Well, let's go one step further. Now, the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah, there is a water source there, there's aquifer there. But there's also a lot of what they call gas plays or shale gas plays. And a play is not something you go see on Broadway, but it's it's what they call sources of underground crude oil or natural gas. They call them plays. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about this is you can extract hydrogen from crude oil or from natural gas pretty easily. And but when you do extract, hydrogen from oil or natural gas, you would have to use some type of mechanical device to extract it. Meaning, some type of device to extract it. And that device will give off electromagnetic field just because of what you're trying to do. It's really easy for anybody to pull hydrogen from water. You can take a glass of water and take a 9-volt battery. Don't drop the battery in the water, okay? So you take a 9-volt battery, you take a couple of wires about, 6 to 8 inches long, and you tie them to the battery, the negative and positive side. Don't touch the sides, the wires together. And in keeping the wires apart, put them in the glass of water and just let it sit there. Now you're going to get a mist eventually coming out. And what you're doing is you're creating hydrogen. That mist is pure hydrogen. So it's easy to extract hydrogen from water. A little bit harder to extract it from oil. But, when you do extract it from oil, or even water too, you will create electromagnetic field. But here's something that's really interesting, Ryan, is for the longest time, as far back as J. Allen Hynek, right, who was investigating UFOs, they were using compasses, and then later on using electromagnetic, field meters. As the technology got a little bit easier. But of course, with J. Allen Hynek, he had the Air Force backing him up, so he had all the cool instruments back then.
Mm-hmm.
So anytime there's a UFO sighting or a touchdown, or there's abundance of UFOs in a certain area, you will get electromagnetic field emanating from that area. Now, electromagnetic fields, we deal with them all the time. Our cell phones, our TVs, and microwaves. Electromagnetic fields are high-frequency radiation. So, we deal with them all the time. But now if you want to look to see where there could be a possibility of an underground base, there may be high levels of EMF emanating from that area, because of the mechanics and machineries they use. Now, if it's near a water source or near a gas play, then they would be extracting hydrogen, which would give you high EMF. So one way to try and find alien bases across the U.S., first off, is to see where our water sources are. Then we need to see, if we see where our water sources are, you may want to look in that particular area and see if there's, a lot of UFO activity in that particular area. And the other place would be your, like I said, natural gas and crude oil areas, because it can be dispatched somewhere also. So it's kind of a cool theory. I've been working on it for a couple of years. Pinpointing areas that there's a high level of activity, and as obviously we were talking about the Skinwalker Ranch, water there, definitely a lot of oil there. Bradshaw Ranch in Arizona, a place that I've investigated in Missouri, Marley Woods. There's water source there, a couple of other places. So there's a lot of Skinwalker type ranches across the U.S.
Yeah. And Chuck, there's been a little bit of talk by some that soft disclosure has already happened. Do you think that's the case, or what is going on here with the government seemingly taking some ownership for the idea that there may be something else out there? What are your thoughts?
Well, the thing with that is because of social media, and it's a little harder now to suppress information when somebody sees something and they could throw it right on Twitter and and release what they've seen. Mm-hmm. So in the old days, our government used to suppress information from us, and if people really don't believe that, during the atomic period when we were designing the atomic bombs, and you can look this up, it's a little hard to find, but you can find information on it, that our government actually pulled words out of the English language. They pulled words like nuclear and atomic and certain words like that. They pulled them from comic books. They pulled them from any type of periodicals. They didn't want other countries to know that we were in a process of designing atomic bombs. So our government does have a way of keeping information from us. And then also from the longest time until social media became so popular, there were certain words that reporters that couldn't talk about, certain things you couldn't say. There was a blacklist or a hit list.
Mm-hmm.
And back in the day, you would talk to the reporters and you're saying, is this hit list true? Is this? And there were certain words that they couldn't say. Reporters couldn't say, especially during the space race, back in the 60s. So our government's really good at suppressing information. Now we've stepped to, 21st century, we're looking at the 2000s now with social media. Everybody's got a phone. Anybody who has a smartphone has a camera. They have a video camera. They have a still camera. So they're able, if they see something, they're able to, capture that on an image and then tweet it out or send it out on Facebook or share it with a lot of friends, put it on YouTube pretty quick. So it's a little bit harder to suppress information. And some of the information that's out there, it's pretty credible. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad information. Just for your listeners out there, if someone talks about this really awesome UFO sighting, right, or Bigfoot sighting, and when you go to look at that sighting on their website, they have commercials for it. Most likely, that's not a good sighting. There's a lot of fakers out there, a lot of posers that want you to go to their sites because they make money off of hits. As many hits as they can get from their videos or their audios. And the more times people watch the videos and listen to the audios, they make more money. So, and it always seems to be those particular cases where someone will be looking at an object in the sky. Oh, look at that. And then the object does something phenomenal. Okay. And most of the time that's just all fake because they're making money off of that video. Generally, and it's funny too, when you see a camera set up in a certain area and then a Bigfoot walks by, well, you have to ask yourself, first off, why has that person got that camera in that area? Or even in the sky, why has that person got a camera pointing in the sky? You got to do a little bit of diligence to become a little bit of a detective and say, okay, what was the setup here? Were they just, back in the old days, with the film cameras, there was tons and tons of UFO pictures that showed up in the aftermath. They took a picture of a person, posing, and then when they developed the film, they would see the UFO in the background. Those are pretty true images. Very rarely, in a lot of cases, they would see the UFOs and take pictures of them. But nowadays, it's, unfortunately, you got to weed out all the fakers out there. The other thing, Ryan, is it's starting to turn out now that our pilots, people in our military on bases, are starting to report this also on social media. They're going around the system. Back in the day, after World War II, everybody was very, very true, to the military and to our government. If someone walked up from the military and told you, don't say anything about it, you didn't say anything about it, especially the Roswell back in 47, that whole incident. We were very, very patriotic. A lot of changes since then. The newer generations, younger generations, are not as patriotic as the older generations, and so they're more liable to speak out against it. This includes our fighter pilots and people within the military. They're starting to talk about it. They're starting to shoot it with their own cameras, and it's really, really hard for for our government to suppress that information. So they got to step up and start releasing, and start taking, basically taking the reins and running investigations themselves to lose, so they don't lose that credibility.
Yeah, they do. And I know you have some Area 51 stories, or maybe I'm guessing. Let me ask a two-part question instead for our listeners. What parts of Area 51 have you been to, if you have? And have you seen anything that made you believe we may be testing reverse engineered craft?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've been out here in Colorado probably 23 years now. And so about 24, 25 years ago when I was in California, I actually would, a few times I've been to Rachel, Nevada, and, the black mailbox, which isn't really black, but, that was the area where the mailbox was, and that was where Freedom Ridge was. And I did a lot of research. And back in those days, there was a research center there at Rachel, Nevada, and it was run by a guy named Glenn Campbell, not the singer, but Glenn Campbell. And he had some pretty cool information that he had gathered studying Area 51. He had a couple manuals out. I actually have one of the manuals here that I bought from the research center there at Rachel that basically talked about certain things you would look for when you're researching Area 51 or Groom Lake, which is part of Nellis Air Force Base. And that actually worked for me one time. Back in the day when Radio Shack was around, we had scanners, and we would listen to police and fire and paramedics on scanners. Now, that was before it all became digital. So you would have a crystal radio, or you would just listen to it, and your scanner would scan, just be in scan mode, sweeping stations, and then you would pick up 1M12, 1M12, stuff like that, and you would lock onto that. Well, back in the day, along the dirt roads going into the gates of Area 51, they would know that people were on that road, even though it may be a mile away, because they had sensors on the road. And it was interesting, the sensor would pick up, the movement of a vehicle on the road, or maybe, I don't know how delicate they were, if you were walking, if they could pick you up. But I would take a scanner, my Radio Shack scanner, and it would be scanning, and you'd be in your vehicle driving slowly on the dirt road, and the scanner would stop. You would pick up a signal. You would stop your vehicle, get out, and you would look at the left and right side of right near your vehicle, just outside the road, and you could find one of those sensors, and it was pretty easy to find, even if you had an EMF meter back in the day, because the sensor would be buried in the dirt, but if you walked around, you'd actually find a battery and maybe a solar panel or something to keep that battery charged. Nowadays, it's a lot different because they're a lot more high tech. But I was scheduled to go on Freedom Ridge to take pictures of Area 51, and then about the time I was going to go to Freedom Ridge was land grabbed by Nellis, or by Area 51. So I had hired a guide, and we hiked to the top of Tickaboo Peak. I was probably the third or fourth person to hike to the top of Tickaboo Peak. And off in the distance, you could see Area 51. And I was shadowed by a military person from Nellis to figure out what the heck I was doing there. They probably had the guide that I had hired came from Rachel. I'm sure that that she was bugged. And so when I showed up for the guide to take me to Tickaboo Peak, there was a couple of other individuals there that wanted to go along too. I mean, it was really obvious one was in camels, and and regardless of what he said, he was typical, he was military. And then afterwards, I talked to him after we got back down from Tickaboo Peak. I talked to him in his trailer. It was pretty funny, but. So when I was on top of Tickaboo Peak, I was just using a 35 millimeter camera with a 200 millimeter zoom, taking pictures. And I did capture something going over the base, and it was pretty quick. I got one image of it because it was moving pretty quick, and I had my camera set on not on automatic, but on sports mode to capture anything that was fast and just randomly taking pictures. But the funny thing was, Ryan, was after we got back down from Tickaboo Peak and drove the 20-some miles back to Rachel, where I had an RV there that pulled my Chevy Blazer. I followed the guy that was in military. He was in camels. I followed him back to his trailer without him knowing I was following him, And then once he got his trailer and he was there for a couple of minutes, I walked up to his trailer, knocked on the door, and said, "Campground security." And when he opened up the door, I just looked inside, and that's when I knew for a fact that he was a plant. He said he was just some military guy interested and wanted to go along with me in my vehicle on top of Bigelow Peak. But when I looked at his trailer, he just had a duffel bag and nothing else in the trailer. It was just an empty trailer. And it kind of gave me that deer in the headlight look, like, oh, shit. I said, "So I'm not a threat, am I?" And he goes, "Nah, you're no threat. You're just some UFO nut." Right, which is the website, and which was a license plate on my vehicle in California, too. And we sat down for a good half hour, had a couple of beers, and we talked off the record. So that was pretty cool. Since then, when I did an episode for Unexplained Files Season 2, that whole episode was a Paranormal Highway of America. I got to talk to an individual that worked at Area 51, and he told me some of his experiences too off camera. So that was pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff going on. I do believe, that we had craft there, and we reversed engineer them. I talked to a pilot for that particular episode that was flying near 51, but in legal airspace, and the tower had told him to veer off, to take a wider berth around where he was going, which was in legal airspace, and he wasn't intruding. There's a commercial pilot, so it was like TWA. And when they were diverting further around, he saw these objects come out from the sky, just like hundreds of them, like balls of light come from the sky and go in formation and land on a holographic type of runway. And I interviewed him for Unexplained Files. I also talked with Roger Lear from Lear Jets, and he was a former pilot for the CIA. He also talked about when he flew near Area 51, he saw like a holographic building with runways. So then if you believe Bob Lazar, who said he worked at S4 at Area 51, he talked about reverse engineering the sports model. Mm-hmm. And using gravity B waves. We had gravity A waves, gravity B waves. Nobody talked about that. Using another element too that he talked about. A decade later, Russians and Americans actually located, and the element he was talking about, and now it's an element. Back in the days when Lazar talked about it, they thought he was just making this thing up. And even with gravity A and gravity B waves, within the past few years, they've talked about different gravity waves that we have. And this is stuff that he talked about 2-3 decades ago, that scientists now are affirming. So, yeah, I would believe Bob Lazar. I tried to get him for the TV show Unexplained Files. At the time, he wasn't lecturing. He was staying kind of quiet. But I seem to think once he saw, I'm not going to take the credit for it, but it just appeared coincidence that after my 1-hour episode of Unexplained Files, after talking to Roger Lear talked about Bob Lazar, Bob Lazar started coming out talking again. So I'd like to think that maybe that particular episode sparked Lazar to, go back on to the speaking circuit and talk about it.
Yeah, it is an interesting, very interesting story and case with Bob Lazar. And, I am a sucker for interesting stories. You've had quite a few travels. In your travels, have you had cryptid or skinwalker stories, or maybe even Men in Black? Have you come across any good stories like that in your travels?
Well, kind of yes and no. People talk about the Men in Black, and in my opinion, Men in Black are nothing more than, the security for our government. Now, I can tell you this, that maybe shadow people at one point, were considered Men in Black. But we've always had an organization within our government that was suppressing, UFO activity, and then or trying to get it out, to the public, and they were running their own investigations. And recently, 2017 or so, the Pentagon came out and said, "Oh, by the way, right, we've been investigating UFOs, and we've had such and such of a budget, and most of that budget went to Robert Bigelow." And there's another story associated with Bigelow and me. But so Robert Bigelow was using the majority of the budget from the Pentagon to research or investigate UFOs. I can tell you a little bit about that in a bit. Mm-hmm. And that came out public. And then, obviously, recently, we've known the Pentagon's always been kind of interested in ufology. Now, I've been doing this about 35 years now, and when I was investigating Roswell, really pretty good, really, when I lived in California, because it was easier to get to. And when I came out here to Colorado, I went back to Roswell a couple times, and we did some archaeology digs for the Sci-Fi Channel. And the second one that my sister and I did on our own with University of New Mexico archaeologists after the TV show had finished taping and they were gone, we stayed the next day and did our own dig. We found a piece of metal where we wanted to dig and not where TV wanted us to dig. And I went public on that in Roswell Pacific Center, and it was aluminum silicon metal with trace elements of titanium. And when I went public and asked for help to try and do lab analysis on this further, who pops up but Robert Bigelow, BAAS, B-A-A-S. And they did, they wanted the artifact to do further analysis. Now, at the time, we didn't know that BAAS was working for the Pentagon. We found that out later, 2017, 18, whatever. But at the time, we didn't know that. I had a suspicion that he worked for the CIA. When I was with MUFON, I was one of the STAR team investigators. The STAR team investigator, you have volunteer investigators working for MUFON, and then you have the more experienced investigators are the STAR team. And Robert Bigelow, when MUFON came out and said, we're going to start a STAR team, a rapid response team, investigators, Bigelow had popped up and says, well, I'm going to fund it. Okay. And when he started funding, matter of fact, the very first STAR team investigation was mine, was a cattle mutilation out here in Colorado that had a UFO sighting. And that was the very, very first STAR team investigation that MUFON had. And then so I assembled a team, and we went down to over to Weston, Colorado. And when I reported my findings afterwards, I didn't get paid for it because once Bigelow read their findings, he says, well, I'm only going to fund those investigations that you have actual evidence of a UFO. And I went, wow, what a dick. I spent all this money, went down there, as a STAR team investigator, and then, anyway. So at that time, I knew he was kind of shady, and I had inclinations that he wasn't funding STAR team investigations or STAR team for MUFON. That he was more like funneling the money from somewhere else, and I thought he was funneling it from the CIA. So I had thoughts about it back then about Bigelow not being trusted, and as it turns out, I was correct. And it was just one of these things. My spider senses, right? Mm-hmm. My spidey senses were telling me not to trust this guy. But when he popped up a couple of years later, after the STAR team incidents, during the STAR team investigations, we found out from other investigators across the U.S. that when they submitted an investigation for a STAR team investigation, and it was approved because it had to be approved not only through MUFON, but it had to be approved through Bigelow, because Bigelow was paying for it. There was a delay of a couple of days before they got the opportunity, before Bigelow approved it, the investigators will go out to do the investigation. The eyewitnesses, you were already here. Eyewitness would say, hey, you guys were already here the other day, and you already interviewed us. And the MUFON investigator said, no, we're here for the first time. Well, it turned out in a couple of really good investigations, Bigelow was sending his own team. That's why there was a delay of a couple of days before he would prove it, because he would say, hey, this looks pretty good. He would run his own team out there and jump MUFON. So not to be trusted type of a person. He's a nice guy. I'm not knocking it. You know, he's a billionaire. I don't want to get him mad at me. But he's a nice guy. He had his own sighting when he was a kid. So he's got the money, and he's just taking the reins by himself. Would I do it myself if I had a billion, you know, millions of dollars? Maybe, you know. But, you know, he just wasn't up in front honest with the people he was dealing with. And also around that time, after I did my press release, I got this phone call. This is when cell phones were fairly new, and you didn't have access to cell phone numbers. So I would get a phone call on my cell phone. It'd be a very polite gentleman on the other side, and he'd say, Mr. Zukowski, I'd like to ask you about your thoughts and what you found out about the Roswell debris that you guys found, you know, in 6 to 8 inches of dirt in the middle of the desert, you know. And not to be on anybody's bad side, whatever you want to know, I will share that information with you. And I told him everything. I told him exactly what I found out, my analysis, how I got to what I did to get those analyses. And we had maybe 20, 25 minutes on the phone, and he said, thank you very much. I said, hey, feel free to call me again. You have any other questions? A couple of years later, I get another call. I can't remember if it's the same guy or not. It was years later. But it was another male voice, Mr. Zukowski. You've been doing a lot of cattle mutilation investigations. I go, yeah. He says, what are your findings? What are your thoughts? Once again, I'm not going to hold anything back from these guys. You don't want to end up, you know, you don't want to disappear. You don't want to end up dead like Max Spears did a couple of years ago. An investigator in Poland ended up, you know, they found him dead in a hotel with black ooze coming out of his mouth because he stepped over the line. You don't want to step over the line when you do what we do. So I told him what he needed to know. And so I think what happened is now, in light of the Pentagon coming out, I was probably talking to representatives, people from the Pentagon, you know, in that special unit that was funding Bigelow. I know it wasn't Bigelow per se, but I think it was, you know, people within that, you know, specific investigative group that was being funded by the Pentagon. Pretty excited about that. So that's my brush with, you know, yes, I've been followed a couple times. My sister's been followed a couple times, but these aren't, if you want to call them MIBs, in my opinion, the MIBs, the men in black are just, you know, just agents. That they want to know what we found out. You have to understand that when we investigate UFO sightings, sometimes the UFO sightings we're investigating could be and have been black op projects for the military. You know, certain areas, I know of a couple of areas right now, I don't disclose it, but I know of a couple of areas where I believe there's a skunk works facility there. 2 separate places, one in Kansas and one in Colorado, because of UFO sightings. Once I realized, you know what, you know, that's military. You know, that's skunk works. They're doing blah, 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 you know, like the stealth fighter, you know, the F-11-17A. They thought that was a UFO. I mean, that was, so I don't want to release or come out with any information if I believe it's a military base. Why? Because I don't want to put, you know, I have 2 sons in the military. I want them to have the best technology they can get to keep them safe and keep all our soldiers safe. So, you know, why ruin that by, you know, now, as an experienced investigator, I can tell the difference between what could be military and what could be not military. And that would be my background in microchip design. I know what we should have. I know what we could have because I know what I'm designing. I've been on design teams for the Deep Space Probe and the Spice satellite. So I have an idea. I'm one of the few lucky ones that can say, you know, okay, I'm not going there because I believe it's going to be military, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's okay. There's so many sightings out here. You know, I'll just go on to the next. Have I been shadowed? No, I have been shadowed, but I've never been threatened.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I agree that our military should have the best of everything and the advantage as well. And Chuck, let's talk gear for a minute because you always have the sweetest gear. What kind of camera are you typically using to shoot UFOs these days?
Well, I mean, I have a really cool. I think it's a 15 or 14 Canon. I use that for interviews and stuff, and I have wireless mics for that. I have an Aurora Pro 4. It's about $900. It's a small camera, and it shoots day and night vision. It'll shoot night vision in color. It works out pretty well. I have a couple. I just acquired a couple of Hero 10s. A GoPro Hero 10s. If people are going to buy, now what I like about GoPros, and this is what I don't like about these ghost shows on TV. And we did something a little different with Alien Highway. When we ventured out, I was with the cameraman. We always made sure we had a camera on us. When my son ventured out on his own, we attached a GoPro to his chest. Yeah, if he saw something, it was picked up on a GoPro. When you watch these goofy, and I'm so frustrated with these guys because the majority, 90% of the evidence they claim they catch, it's not. You know, houses creak, shadows. They say they saw a shadow. Cameras don't pick them up. Blah 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 blah. You know, a good investigator will attach a damn GoPro to his forehead or to his chest. So if he sees something, we get to see it too. Oh my God, did you see that? No, we didn't because you don't have a camera. We just have to take your word for it. So in my investigations, you know, I strap a GoPro to my chest. And so if I see something, there's evidence of it. That's why we do it. That's the whole reason of being an investigator. GoPro Hero 10s. 9s right now. It's a good price on 9s right now, but spend a couple extra dollars and get the 10. The reason why is the 10's got a new microprocessor. And there's a lot of cool things that new camera will do. The last microprocessor, I think, was from Hero 5 to 9. So you're buying something that's outdated. If you don't care, you know, and you're just using it for vacations, go with the 9. It's fine. But if you want to use something a little bit better, so I have two GoPro Hero 10s. I have a night vision. I have night vision binoculars. I have a multitude of EMF meters. I have metal detecting wand, metal detector. Gosh, I turn around and probably look at all my gear behind me. You know, there's. I have a full spectrum camera. Now this is kind of cool. Now these are not something that you can just. I have a FLIR camera too. A full spectrum camera, and I've been using this for a couple times now. You have to buy aftermarket stuff if you want to shoot full spectrum. Excuse me. Now full spectrum generally you have to shoot at night because it's ultraviolet UV. But if you, what I did is I found a camera that I could put a lens on that has the threads on the camera so you can screw a lens on it. And that probably goes back to I have a telescope, so I'm an amateur astronomer, and we use lenses all the time, filters, when you look at, you know, different nebulas to bring out the colors. Excuse me. So I found a lens that blocks out all the white light. So I screw that onto my full spectrum camera. That way I can shoot during the daytime. And I can shoot UV and IR during the daytime, blocking out the white light. Now, why would I do that? Because I'm looking for evidence that our eyes don't see. When you use a regular camera and you're doing a UFO investigation, I can tell you, I'm not with the Sheriff's Department anymore. I was with them for 8 years as a volunteer deputy. But the one thing that detectives use, right, law enforcement detectives, is the whole purpose of a detective is to try and find evidence that's there, and they have to look for it. Now, the thing about being a cop or going into being a detective is there's hundreds and hundreds of books on how to be a cop and how to be a detective. And every crime that's committed, there's evidence left there. Now, it's up to the detective to try and find the evidence that's left there to find out who committed the crime. Well, if you look at UFOs that way, and something touched down or something was here and people saw it, we know there's evidence there. Now, as an investigator, we have to figure out, okay, we know it's evidence that we can't see it, but there's evidence there, so we have to figure out, okay, how can we find something we can't see? How can we find something we don't know about? How can we find evidence that we don't know what type of evidence it is, but we know it's evidence there just by, thinking analytically. Okay, so one way is using a full spectrum camera and hoping that maybe there might be evidence there that the human eye can't see, but the camera can pick up. So stuff like that. EMF meter, that's the same thing. We use EMF meters all the time. Outside of Skinwalker, when we shot with you, we picked up high levels of EMF outside Skinwalker Ranch. Cool place, right? But as you know, Ryan, that's not the central of the activity. That's just one of the spots of where activity is. You could probably be in at least a 5-mile radius of that place and catch just as much evidence as what they catch on Skinwalker, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you saw your evidence that you saw. What you saw wasn't at the ranch. Yeah. It was outside the ranch. Mm-hmm. So we use EMF meters to look for stuff like that. I'm going to let you talk for a second so I can sip some coffee.
You bet. And, you've researched many of the places that are my favorites. And one of my favorite states for UFOs is obviously Colorado. And it's mind-blowing to me. It's also one of the states with one of the deep underground military bases that have been disclosed, which is Cheyenne Mountain. And are there any mind-bending events or bizarre incidents you can tell us about that made an impression on you out of all the probably wild stuff that you've come across in Colorado?
Well, I'm going to have to say animal mutilations. Now, I've seen UFOs. I've seen a craft. I think it was ours, the way that I was maneuvering, and it came from an area where I think it was a skunk works facility. So I'm just saying, I think the only metallic craft I think I saw, really cool looking, pretty awesome looking, I think it might have been one of ours. Or it could have been one of those, ones that were reverse engineered. Okay. I've seen balls of light, and I've recorded them. And in 2016, July 3rd, my sister and I, outside of Roswell, actually communicated with the UFO or light in the sky, about 9:30, 9:45 at night. We were, basically flashing my headlights on my truck, and it was flashing back, and we were going back and forth, and the shit hit the fan after that. That's a pretty cool story. Mm-hmm. Out here in Colorado, where I've seen lights, I've done some Bigfoot investigations, and I've done those investigations. It's the cattle mutilation stuff that's really bizarre, because the majority of the ranchers that I've dealt with are second, third generation ranchers, and they know how an animal dies naturally or how it could be poisoned. But when they see something that's completely off the wall, never seen before in their life, it scares the hell out of them. Because something out there is killing an 1,100-pound animal, draining it of blood, cutting it up, and it's sitting there, and they don't know what to do. There's other things involved in animal mutilations. We could probably do a whole other hour on just animal mutilations, of what's an animal mutilation and what's not. But I've investigated dead cows, dead horses, goats, dogs. So it's just not count. It's bizarre. And then in a lot of cases, balls of light are seen. One case, a craft was seen before the mutilation. Most of the time, they're balls of light that are seen before. a mutilation occurs, maybe a month, maybe 2 weeks before. And then in some cases, in Colorado, also in Illinois, only because it was one of my cases in Illinois, we know about this, that black helicopters, unmarked helicopters, will show up afterwards. Now, for those people out there that are saying, well, it's the helicopters that are doing it, and they're marking their next cows, okay, just who's ever saying that, just put your hand, push it through the internet, and slap them on the side of the face, and knock some sense into them, because they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't been doing this 35 years. They're just speculating, whatever, for whatever reason. It goes back to these guys are running their own investigations. So when these unmarked helicopters show up, and they have, on a few of my investigations, after the fact, they'll show up and they'll run their own investigation. Usually at night, the helicopter will hover over the area where the mutilation occurred, and they have some pretty high-tech instruments, I'm guessing, and running their own investigations. Generally, they do it afterwards because they don't know about them, right? Mm-hmm. Once I do them and I put them on the website, or once they go public and they're in the media, now they know about it. They're just, they don't have this giant satellite up there keeping track. They do, and they may catch something, if they may catch some activity in a certain area, and they can go look in that particular area for what happened there, and it turned out it could be a mutilation. Because I know from a fact from working on the spy satellite that you could see it. Well, for all your listeners out there, we just had that massive volcano off the coast of Tonga, right? Mm-hmm. They captured some awesome real-time satellite images of this volcano erupting underwater, and the eruption underwater is larger than Texas. So, we have spy satellites that are real time, not just taking pictures. They are real time.
It's unbelievable, and a lot. It really is a lot of the research is going in all kinds of different directions when it comes to UFOs and UAPs, as they're calling them, and it is. I'm seeing a lot going into the consciousness route. It's almost become a catchphrase. Do you think that consciousness is the future of UFO research?
That's kind of hard to say. There's always been something involved in that when you get into the metaphysical side. But UAP, the word UAP has been around since the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Something the Air Force has started. UFO was picked up in 1947, with a Mount Rainier sighting. Conscious. You don't want to leave that out. I'm very analytical, so I attack things from the analytical side to gather evidence using, tools any of your listeners can go out and buy and do themselves, right? Mm-hmm. When you start doing stuff, and you're talking about maybe doing stuff by meditating or consciousness or, or something like that, that's an iffy thing. I've dealt with some mediums and people that are intuitive, and in my opinion, it's unless you can actually get physical evidence in it. As an investigator, one of the things, and my wife is a skeptic, and I've been married to her for 40 years. So one thing I've learned that makes me a better investigator than other investigators is because my wife's a skeptic, and I just can't. If there's a light in the sky, I just don't say UFO. I have to eliminate all possibilities and plausibilities of what that light is before I say it's an unknown. Ergo, that's why, I became an amateur astronomer in California and then out here in Colorado. You don't know the night sky. Right now, we're getting crap load of UFO sightings because of Starlink. Thank you, Musk. I'd like to smack him in the side of the face, for polluting our atmosphere for, monetary gain. But that's what he's doing by throwing up all these, eventually he says, well, you're not going to be able to see the satellites, but then he's still kind of polluting the atmosphere, our space with all these little satellites the size of basketballs or whatever the size are. But we get a lot of sightings. Starlink people say, "Oh my God, we're getting invaded. I saw 40 lights in the string." Well, that's what the Starlinks are. But that's physical evidence, though. So before you can say, and unfortunately, there's websites you can go to. And for all your listeners out there, if you want to see what these things look like, you can go to a website and actually look up Starlink and where you can spot them and stand out there that night if it's clear night and watch them go by. Same thing with the ISS, space station, or any type of satellite. But you have to have physical evidence. You have to eliminate all the possibilities first, physically, before you can say otherwise. And the reason why you want to do that is because you're eliminating the debunkers by doing that. When the debunker says, well, how do you know? Like the 37th panel. I go, well, I've got 100 GPS coordinates of all these things that are across the U.S. If it was good enough for the Science Channel, when they asked me about the 37th panel, they said, well, what do you got on it? I just flooded them with all my data. And they went, holy shit, this guy's onto something, right? The same thing with the hydrogen theory. You just can't guess. You have to do your research, and you have to show why you came to that. When you get into talking to someone that's, a medium or a psychic, and they say, well, I feel this and that. Well, you gotta, okay, that might be true, but I can't prove it. You gotta give me some proof. Now, I have worked with him in the past, and there was one psychic we were supposed to go. Psychic said that there was a Bigfoot family that wanted to meet us, and so I drove 5 hours with another Bigfoot investigator to meet this Bigfoot family that wanted to meet us based on a psychic, because I was on her radio show once. I thought, what the hell, give it a shot. You don't want to say that's stupid. For God's sakes, I look for aliens, so how can I say things are stupid, right? The Bigfoot sighting turned into a UFO event. So she led us to an area. There was no Bigfoot, but something else happened there, possible animal mutilation, and there was a UFO that with strange lights and all kinds of stuff. No Bigfoot. So I can't disregard stuff like that, right?
Right. Yeah, it's important stuff, and it's so fascinating. And worldwide, this is really. It seems that this is really getting traction, and I'm sure you've noticed this that it's more mainstream than it ever has been before. As we wrap up, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And could you tell listeners where they can go to your website? It's such a great website with. I like the way it's organized, and it's got great articles, and you've got so much going on there. Could you tell listeners where they can keep up with you? And yeah, is this a good thing or a bad thing that it's going so mainstream?
It's a good thing that it's going so mainstream because it's June 25th last year. It was a big "I told you so" when the Pentagon came out and said, and they have different categories of UFO sightings, right? And out of 144 or so, they were able to recognize one, which was balloons. That means 143 they couldn't recognize our latest and greatest instruments and technology, and the fighter jets couldn't recognize it, which is kind of scary. They couldn't keep up with them. And so they throw that into the other category, what is the other category? It's the UFO category. They just didn't want to say it. So it was a big aha and a big plus for us investigators when that came out, last year. And we got things rolling. I'm upset with the media because they're not covering it as much as they should, and I'm upset with TV because they're still pushing ghost shows because you can fabricate the evidence so much and manipulate the audience that it's become nothing but Gilligan's Island paranormal, episode.
Mm-hmm.
As for me, my website is ufonut.com. That's UFO nuts, like an acorn nut. And the reason why it's called that, because way back years ago when I first started in this, people would call me, "You're just a UFO nut." So instead of getting mad, I rolled with it, and now it's an acronym. So, basically UFO nut stands for Unconventional Flying Objects, Non-Human, Unrecognizable Technology. I kind of ran with it. UFO nut, I actually trademarked that, so now that's my name. So I own it now, too.
It's cool.
I had nothing to do during COVID, so I trademarked UFO nut. I couldn't run any investigations. So UFOnut.com. On the top, you'll see home button, Chuck Zukowski, email Chuck. I get all my emails. If you have any questions, email me. I answer them all back. I'm not working with a TV show right now, so if you're looking to get a TV show or someone from TV down there to investigate one of your events or your sightings, I can't help you at this point. But the best I can do is keep the information in case something pops up. Like I said, for whatever reason, TV is still loving ghosts, which is kind of stupid.
So true, though, and just many thanks for all the research you've done, and it's awesome to talk to you again. I hope we talk again, and thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
I really appreciate it, and it was a pleasure working with you too. Matter of fact, we had suspicions about you, so
Cool.
of working for somebody else, right?
Mm-hmm.
So only because how professional you portrayed yourself was a little bit different than other witnesses we talked to. So you were a red flag at first, not now, but at first, and that's only because you're very professional. So thank you for that.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
Okay.
Right
Thank
on.
you for having me on your podcast.
All right. Take care, Chuck.
Thank you. Talk to you later.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. The amazing Chuck Zukowski. And amazing research. He's always got great theories. Checks out the most bizarre incidents. Happy he could tell us about the ones that made an impression on him. And definitely go to ufonut.com. Keep track of what Chuck's got going on. He's always got a lot going on in the research field. So, it was great talking to him, and thanks for listening. Until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off.